So Brett, you mentioned a moment ago that you're agnostic. So I don't know what your full faith background is. And Christian, I'm not familiar with your faith background either, but I know Anastasia's been on the show a few times. I kind of know where she's coming from, and obviously her dad did make an independent film that was faith based. And ultimately, like to your point that you mentioned a moment ago, Brett, like, yeah, and to Anastasia's point, Christian filmmakers have done a terrible job of making some of the most cheesiest, like you need a lot of wine with that cheese. And it's unfortunate because, to your point, Brett, like God's Not Dead. I mean, the guys behind that, I mean, big hearts, amazing people. But, in the God's Not Dead movies, I think the only two atheists in the movie both end up dying by the end. One has cancer, one gets hit by a car. Like, so it's just a horrible, like, I don't even think that they meant that. It's just like, it was like hindsight. They didn't even realize that they wrote in the only two non-believers ended up getting one cancer, one gets hit by a car, but ultimately the heart behind like a Christian creative, like Anastasia's dad, for example, would be ultimately to reach people like you, Brett. Ultimately the hope is that the story can be something that can move you to ask bigger questions that could potentially lead you to ultimately discover what we believe, which is that Christ is the savior of the world. So I'm curious, like, what was your thoughts on recent films? Like, have you seen like the Blind, Jesus Revelation, or Nefarious?
I saw Nefarious. I like Nefarious. It's funny. It's Sean Patrick Flannery's in that, right? But I was a big fan of Jordan Belfry, who's the other actor in there, who's he's a great, he's one of those actors. If you watch a lot of TV, he has had a guest starring role in just about everything you've ever seen. And I always love seeing actors like that show up in more prominent roles. I did like Nefarious, probably most the last 3/4 of the movie, like the last quarter of the movie, from the part where he's taken back to his cell and onward. I thought that was very, very well done. And the thing is it looks good, right? And back in the day, it was a lot different because there's so much infrastructure behind Hollywood that even at a medium budget, CGI notwithstanding, the project looks professional. It looks fantastic, like like an untrained eye. And one of the things that a lot of the movies that were made either faith-based or just independent films with less actual infrastructure behind it is, like, when you watch something and you're used to seeing the Hollywood the sleek Hollywood look, right? You already have that working against you. So if you're trying to get something across to people and the production value isn't there to keep them engrossed in the story, then your story is going to have an even harder time getting through to people. And neither Exemplum nor Nefarious had that problem. They both did the most with what they had, and I thought it was fantastic.
So I know we're picking on a lot of Christian films, but also, I think we should all cut them some slack because they existed. They created their own genre out of nowhere. I mean, they didn't go to film school, most likely. They didn't get the support of studios. They just did it on their own, like a bunch of kids with the Super 8 camera going up and trying something new. So, I mean, yes, it was often terrible, but I just think they had to go through those phases to learn and grow. And what Brett's saying is so true, because the technology today, I have a buddy who just showed me a rough cut of his new film. It's coming out next year. It's called The Sasquatchologist. It looks great. It looks great. And it's a very good film. And I didn't see with all this sort of sound attached to it and all, but the fact that he can make that movie on a zero budget, essentially, and it looks rich, and there's drone shots, and the cinematography is beautiful on a dime. And that's an exciting thing to happen. And that's going to help the Blazes and the Daily Wires really enter the space with full force and say, hey, our movie looks as good as yours. Sorry, the way it's going to be.
I also have to add, too, I think that faith-based movies, we're at a different time period. We have to make different movies than we had to before. Yeah. Whereas I think we're in a different time, and we're living in a different world where evil is being perpetuated again and again and again and made to look better than what is good. And I'm not saying that wasn't happening before. I'm more so saying that that's happening more on a mainstream level as it's infiltrating more movies and more TV shows, to our point that we find ourselves going back to older movies. It's because it just because it just had a mom and a dad who ate dinner together at the table. It's as simple as that. And nowadays you don't even see things like that as much. And so I think it's a different time period to make movies, because I mean, the same people who made God's Not Dead also made Nefarious as well. And so, and I think seeing their, not only their growth, but seeing them recognize we're in need for more movies like Nefarious, not only in production value, not only in trying to infiltrate more mainstream media, but also just the storyline and the just calling out what is evil as well. I think we're in a time period where that is more, has become more necessary, and but more Christians, their eyes are being open to the fact that that has become more necessary.
Yeah. Aaron Wren, who's been on the show before, he talks about kind of the development as far as from a Christian viewpoint of how we used to kind of live in what he calls the positive world, where people used to view being a Christian in America, for example, as a net positive, like it was a net positive in politics, for example. And then he kind of talks about how we eventually slid into kind of the neutral world, which is kind of like the 90s, kind of that time frame, where things, slowly, scandals in the White House, for example, that's one metric that he uses to measure it. They became less and less of a big deal when we learn about, at one point, presidents having an affair. I mean, it was like a political suicide, but then eventually it turned into kind of, politicians are sleazy. It's just kind of how it is. And eventually it gets to the point where, now we're in what you would call a negative world, where now it's no longer, not only is it not a net positive, but now it's kind of a loss if you identify openly as a Christian in areas of politics or career and things like that. And so, to your point, Anastasia, I think we need stories that can cut through the negative world and know what time it is, because we're not in a hunky-dory time frame where if we just kind of say the right message and we just kind of soften our blows, the certain way, we're going to reach people in a positive way that's going to have any lasting impact. And
you don't, and to be fair, you don't always need a Nefarious like that just straight up just calls it out like it is and is scary. It is supposed to be scarier and it's supposed to freak people out. Like we were mentioned Jesus Revolution earlier. Like I think a movie like that, which I would say is the complete opposite of my dad's movie, also does that, but in a different, more of wanting to gain an emotional response of we're just going to put this out, and it's kind of just telling the story. But like I found people like in the theater I was in just crying and finding an emotional response to it, because at the end of the day we can all resonate to what things used to look like or what things used to be like in the positive, I guess you're kind of talking about as well.
Yeah. It'll be very hard to pull that back. Like, look, right now, one of the big reasons that is so difficult to do is you've got decades upon decades of neo-Marxism that has told you that Christianity and in any such branch of the Catholic Church, for instance, that they are part of the oppressor class, right? That's why they hold Christianity, Catholicism. It's why they hold that aspect of religion to a different standard than they hold Islam or Judaism, because there are religions you're allowed to criticize.